Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Matthew Hadawani, and I am extremely excited to be joined by Buffalo Bills lead journalist and insider, Chris Brown. Chris, how are you doing today?
Doing good, doing good.
Perfect. So you attended the State University of New York College at Geneseo, earning a communications major and a minor in management. Was writing in sports journalism the area that you kind of always saw yourself getting into?
Um, it's a little more complicated than that. I always kind of had a passion for sports, and I wanted to kind of pursue a communication degree, but I was talked out of that by my father. When I first went to college, he saw it as a very risky career field, and he kind of twisted my arm to declare as a business major, which I did my sophomore year, if I remember right. And I went into it a little reluctantly, but was just trying to respect what my father was trying to tell me. And economic statistics is what I have to thank for talking me out of it, because I took a W in that class because I withdrew from the class, fortunately, before the deadline, because it was boring me to tears and confusing the hell out of me. And I basically said, I can't do it. My heart's not in it. And pretty much got on the phone with my parents and convinced them that I had to change my major to communication. And I did that. And I was behind. I had to play a lot of catch up my last 2 years of undergrad to complete my degree requirements. But my dad said, well, if you want to do it, then put in the extra work to get it done, because I'm not paying for you for college after 4 years. So the impetus was there, suffice to say.
After graduating, you landed a role with WGR 550 in Buffalo, covering the Bills as a beat writer. What did that position and being on the beat kind of teach you about the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't just walk into that job out of school. I I got a job at an oldies radio station in Niagara Falls, which in a crazy format also had news every half hour. Not too many oldies stations have that anymore, but they did. And I worked two jobs my first 3 years out of college to pay rent and cover expenses and bills. So I don't want to make it sound like I walked right out of school into this great job or whatever. So then I went to WGR first as a news reporter before their beat reporter job for the Bills opened up 2 years later. And then I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time. So um, I I credit a lot of my experience in my news background to helping me immeasurably in covering the team as a reporter, because I got a lot of really good experience covering news stories, city hall, politics, all of that stuff kind of rounded my skills into form, where covering a sports team was a much easier lift than it should have been for someone who was only 25 years old at the time.
On top of being a reporter, you were also a play-by-play voice for the Arena Football League and the Mid-America Conference. Was kind of play-by-play and being live on air an area you were always interested in?
Yeah, that was the ultimate goal, actually. That is still something I'd like to do more of here later in my career if the opportunity presents itself, because, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that kind of had this thing in my head, but um, I grew up in a household in the greater New York metropolitan area. I didn't have cable in my house growing up as a kid in the 80s. So I was largely forced to follow my favorite sports teams that were already moving to cable networks and stuff on the radio. I'd go to sleep listening to Islanders games when they were going to 4 straight Stanley Cups in the early 80s, because they were already on cable and we didn't have cable in my house. So uh, I developed an affinity for the radio play-by-play broadcasters and the pictures that they had to paint for the listeners every single night. And so I I developed an appreciation for Jiggs McDonald or Marv Albert doing Knick games, or, Bill White and Frank Messer doing Yankees games. So I was forced to appreciate that because that's all that I had as my connection to those teams. And it was something that I wanted to do. And then I would say I was convinced this was going to be my career path between my junior and senior years, when I was fortunate enough to get an internship at WFAN Radio in New York, which was the first all sports format radio station in our country.
Sorry, it takes a special kind of person to be a play-by-play voice. When you were doing it, was it something you felt immediately comfortable with, or did you kind of have to try and find your own voice within the industry there?
I think everybody does have to find their own voice and what works for them. But I basically got a master's class education listening to those guys every night, falling asleep in my bedroom. You get sent to bed, you can't stay up for the whole game, but I just have my radio on my night table and I'm listening to the whole thing until I would finally conk off. But you hear just listening to them, when I'm 12 or 13, I'm not actively listening for professional tips on how to do a game, but I think by osmosis, I kind of learned about pacing, the inflection of your voice, matching your voice to the moment in terms of excitement and things like that. So I think I had a very natural step into doing it myself because of that. Although I had gotten experience through some previous stops doing high school and college games before I was doing Arena League and Mid-American Conference football and basketball.
In 2006, you were named the lead journalist for the Buffalo Bills. Can you kind of take me through that moment when you found out that you were going to be the guy?
Yeah, it was kind of a strange stepping stone kind of period at that time. I had left WGR Radio and worked briefly at the Empire Sports Network covering the Bills. And then some unfortunate circumstances happened with the ownership group of Empire Sports Network. Their CEO basically got taken away by the feds in handcuffs. And that changed the dynamic there, as they ultimately, in a matter of months, went under. But I kind of saw where it was going. And I will always appreciate my department head and boss at the time, John DeMerle, telling me, when I asked him point blank, because I had an opportunity to become the editor of a Bills team paper called Bills Digest while I was still working at Empire Sports Network. And I asked him point blank, I said, look, I know the circumstances that are going on here because we saw it on the nightly news. I have this opportunity over here. I like working in television more than being a written journalist. Should I take the job? And he looked me square in the eye and he said, you should take the job. And I'm glad that he was honest with me, because my previous job proved to be a dead end there. And so being the editor of the team paper for the Bills eventually put me in the right place at the right time when the Bills were looking to expand their web presence on their team website. And I was already essentially in the building, writing stories already. So it was just a natural progression, but it was an example of me being in the right place at the right time too.
In a sense, you're kind of the middleman between the fans and the front office. Does that present any hurdles at all for you for your day-to-day work?
There are hurdles because you're on the team side of the media fence.
Right.
So there are do's and don'ts. Like, pardon my French here, but you can't call the head coach a dumbass. Like you don't do that.
I think that would be frowned upon.
Yeah. So, you have columnists that can call out a head coach. We can't do that. We're in-house. We know who writes our checks and who pays our bills. So we are not true media in the truest sense of the word. We work in a media reporting capacity, but there are ways around those kinds of things that you kind of pick up as you go along. I always tell my interns, because they're concerned about angering anybody with their writing,
Mhm.
And what I tell them is there are ways of explaining how the team came up short or did not do enough to win the football game without criticizing them directly. Number one is you can go to that player directly and ask them for their take on the game, and they're giving you the criticism of their performance coming up short in their own words. And most NFL players are pretty accountable and will tell you point blank, like, yeah, we didn't get the job done. They may give you specifics, they may not. But I tell my use their quotes to tell the critical parts of the story that you as a media member, as an in-house employee, cannot.
Mhm.
Ask or use statistics. If the quarterback threw 4 interceptions and completed 45% of his passes, put those statistics in the story. Anybody who's an NFL fan knows 45% completion and 4 interceptions for a quarterback is a horrible day. So now you don't have to say it because the statistics tell the story for you. So there are ways to still have a critical eye on what you're reporting on without ruffling feathers, shall we say.
Between OTAs, training camp, traveling, practice, and games, does the time-consuming job almost kind of get in the way of things you want to do, outside of the office?
You make sacrifices. I don't think there's any question about that. Traveling with the team during the season, it's a 6-day a week, 7-day a week job for a good 6 months of the year. Training camp is not here in Buffalo. So very often I'm away from my family, an hour and a half down the thruway for 2 or 3 weeks in the summertime. I try to get home as much as I can. I'll even drive back just and get up early the next morning just to kind of catch up with my family. But I really have to give a lot of credit to my wife for kind of holding down the fort at home for many, many years now. And she's got a full-time job herself. So I don't know that I would be able to have the career that I've had were it not for my wife kind of making sacrifices. And I mean, I still remember the time where we had a bad winter storm here, unexpected in October back in 2006, and we lost power to our home. And I basically somehow got my hands on a standby generator and powered up the essential utilities in my house, the refrigerator and a couple of other things, and basically told my wife, all right, just keep the gas tank full on the generator because I have to go to a road game in Detroit. And she's got a 2 and a 4-year-old at home for the weekend with no power. And they're basically sleeping in sleeping bags next to my gas fireplace for heat. And I felt terrible having to leave, but that's just a small example of the sacrifices my wife has undertaken so I could do what I do.
Buffalo is such a unique, sporting city for people who are NFL fans and people who are kind of outsiders to the NFL. But what is it about Buffalo that is just they're passionate about the Bills? I mean, you could send out some information that a player has been signed to the practice squad and the entire fan base will go nuts.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time now, Buffalo eats, lives, and breathes football. It will. I mean, it's a passionate hockey city, but I
Mhm.
think the Bills will always come first. Um, they just love their team, and it's interesting to get the perspective of a lot of players when they come to Buffalo and play for this team because they say they feel like they're being adopted into a family. And that's how the fans treat the players on this team. They treat them like family because they appreciate what they do and what they represent, which is the city. And they're appreciative of that, that players will come here and play hard for you. Come here and you play hard for this team. And it's readily evident on the field. You'll probably never have to buy a drink in Buffalo ever again. And if you win a Super Bowl, you might as well. I mean, I don't know what they do for you. They might even buy you a car. But that's the passion that the fans have here for the team. And like just me covering the team, for the better part of 20 years now, I feel like they've kind of adopted me as family members. Like I'll see them in a parking lot walking back to my car after a game, and yes, they're still here 2 hours after the game talking about what happened. And, they got a barrel on fire in the parking lot to stay warm, and they're having a few extra pops. And, they'll wave to you, they'll say hi, they'll talk to you about the game for 5 minutes, because that's what they do. This is part of their weekly ritual from September to December and hopefully beyond in the playoffs. It's a part of their annual routine in the fall, and it's the fabric of the community in every way, shape, and form.
You mentioned it, but you've kind of been there for 20 years, and over your career, you've covered some not so good teams and recently some very good teams. So how has covering a team that's gone to an AFC championship differ from one that's kind of struggling?
It's a lot more fun, I'll tell you that.
I bet.
It was a long stretch. I mean, I covered this team for the duration of what fans here call the drought, which was 17 years of no playoffs. And it's hard. You have a job to do and you want to do it. And fortunately, the passion of this fan base, there were still diehards who remained engaged, even when this team was clearly an also ran and not going to compete for much of anything. And yeah, it gets tough sometimes, especially when you're making the sacrifices that I just talked about with your family and stuff like that. So it's not easy at times, but it's also your job. And there are a lot of people in this world that are doing much tougher jobs than the one I'm doing. So I always considered myself fortunate to be in the position I was, to be doing a job that I enjoy. So I always tried to remind myself of that when I was witnessing another humbling defeat. So that's kind of how it went for me. And then as you saw Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane come on board and try to turn this thing around, which they've done successfully, it made the job that much more enjoyable. I in fact, even sent Coach McDermott an email after they won the division, and I felt I had to thank him personally for doing what he did and orchestrating this turnaround, because for those of us that have been with the team as employees long enough to have gone through all those lean years to now experience this, it's so easy for us to appreciate because it has been that long.
In August of 2020, you took over for John Murphy on One Bills Live. What's it like doing a 3-hour radio show 5 days a week?
It's certainly different, but it's not hard because I had spent 10 to 12 years in radio and television before drifting over more to the written side of the journalism field. And now that I'm back on this side of it, I'm reminded about how much I enjoy the broadcast realm of the communications business. I just like having conversations, having debates, interacting with fans on a more direct basis. So I do find that enjoyable. I haven't gone completely away on the written side. I'm still helping out on buffalobills.com, but being on this side of it, I do find it more personally rewarding for me. It's the medium that I enjoy the most.
A lot of people know Steve Tasker, the football player, and they're now getting to know Steve Tasker, the radio host. What's he like to work with on a day-to-day basis?
He's a trip. I think there are times where he and I see things the same way almost too much of the time. You do want to disagree a little bit because that makes for better radio and television. Right. But I think we do tend to see a lot of things the same way with respect to the Bills and the NFL at large. I like to say it's just great minds thinking alike, but that would probably be giving myself too much credit. But yeah, no, he's very easy to work with. He's been in the broadcasting field for more than 20 years himself. I mean, he walked out of the locker room and right into broadcasting, right, and he did it at a high level, certainly a higher level than I've ever achieved. I mean, he was doing it at CBS at a major broadcast level and doing games for years. So it makes my job so much easier when I work with someone that's got professional chops like that. And I think that's why we play off each other so well on the show.
We're still living in a very, very different world, obviously, with the pandemic, and we don't know what next season is going to look like. But how did the past season change having to deal with those different protocols?
It was a challenge. It was about a year ago that we got kicked out of our building at One Bills Drive and largely worked from home. And fortunately, the technologies of today allowed us to still be able to do our jobs. And fortunately, the NFL was able to successfully undertake the massive task of pulling off all 256 of their regular season games
Incredible.
during a pandemic, and came up with ways with the Players Association, I should mention, on how to navigate roster size, protocols, as you mentioned, and doing Zoom calls until we're blue in the face for interview purposes, just so the media and people like me can do our job as well. And I know our ownership appreciated us kind of plowing through that whole thing and getting through the season, which proved to be a very successful one. So I think after this, everything's going to seem a whole lot easier than it used to, because the hoops we had to jump through were challenging at times.
Yeah, absolutely. With last season in the books, looking forward to next season, what are you most excited about?
The fact that this team is in a position where they can perennially contend. I think they're at a point now with a very strong young core group of talented players that, so long as Brandon Beane and his personnel department continue to make good decisions in the draft and in free agency, that they'll have this team properly positioned for year over year success, which is easier said than done in a league as highly competitive as the NFL. So they've got this team on a track to be successful for a long time. And I think that's what is exciting, to be in a position like I'm in, as well as exciting for the fan base.
Absolutely. And as a Bills fan, I can say that it was a joy to watch the team last season, and extremely excited for the next. But Chris, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I know you're extremely busy, man, with the draft and free agency coming up. So from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Yep. Good to be with you. Good luck to you, Matthew.
Appreciate it. Thank you.